Hi everyone and welcome to The Networks. I'm Gareth Spence. In a few weeks' time, the optical networking industry will descend on San Francisco for one of the most important events on the calendar, OFC. This year's show marks a major milestone as the event celebrates its 50th anniversary. To guide me through what's happening at the show and some of the hot topics we can expect to see, I'm joined by Adtran Jörg-Peter Elbers and industry analyst Roy Rubenstein. Gentlemen, are you ready to celebrate the show's 50th anniversary?
Absolutely, Gareth. I'm really looking forward to it. The past 50 years have been packed by innovation on the component system and network level. And the internet, which has radically changed our societies and economies, owes its existence to optical communication. So if that's not a reason to celebrate, what is?
And in my case, Gareth, I'm really looking forward to OFC. And also, having just come from ECOC 6 months ago, that was the first celebration of this 50th anniversary. And it'll be interesting to see how OFC celebrates it.
How many years have you guys been going to the show?
In my case, I was thinking about this. It was 2001, and I actually went before I really joined the optical industry, and it was just mind-blowing because it was the dot-com bubble, and it was just an amazing time for optics.
My first OFC was in 1998, so over 25 years ago. I was still a PhD student at that point. I was very excited. I presented a fiber optic system simulator in a Sunday workshop there. And I was really thrilled to meet so many luminaries from industry and academia. I'd read a lot of papers, but I could meet the people face to face, ask questions. They were all approachable. And that really became an inspiration for my work. And since then, OFC really feels like a homecoming for me.
I think many in the industry would probably feel the same way. It does feel like an annual get-together.
Absolutely. And I think we went through ups and downs, I would say. I think, Roy, you mentioned the bubble years, which I think were tremendous, which with parties, live music, everything went through maybe a little bit of depression in between. And now AI is driving everything, and I think there's a lot of new excitement in the industry, I would say.
You talk about excitement there within the industry. What are the major innovations that you've seen over the years that you've been attending the show?
I would maybe start even a little earlier, right? So as we celebrate 50 years, if we kind of go back, what happened 1975? I mean, this was a time where people were discussing how to get megabits over a fiber. They used multimode fiber at that time. They were thinking about getting longer repeater spacing, something like 10 kilometer, to address telephony applications. And since then, I think there have been breakthrough inventions such as low loss single mode fibers, room temperature semiconductor lasers, optical amplifiers, and those really became a game changer and enabled the internet as we know it today, right? We're advancing now to petabit per second of speeds unimaginable in 1975. We can transmit over thousands of kilometers without electronic regeneration. We're exploring new fiber types, massive electrophotonic integration, digital signal processing as complex as you have in GPUs in your latest iPhone to meet the growing bandwidth demands of AI and cloud services. So really impressive. And I think at the same time, we're also seeing that optical communication gets further pushed down to the edge, to homes, to antennas, to the room, to the printed circuit board. So it appears that optical innovation really never ends.
And in my case, Gareth, I really am grateful to have experienced that dot-com period because it was the emergence of so many startups doing so many different things. It was just a remarkable period. But it also taught me a lot. For example, how that whole period evolved. And then, of course, the painful period afterwards. So that's one thing I would say is a key chapter. And, of course, you never forget it. Having experienced it, you never forget it. The other thing I would highlight, which is what Jörg described, is two developments. The advent of coherent optics. Again, when I started covering OFC, it was all about pushing to get to 40 gigabits per second and all the problems with fiber. And then all of a sudden, semiconductor-based DSP came along and it changed everything. And the progress hasn't stopped. It's coherent optics it just continues to surprise in terms of how it's developing. And the other thing is silicon photonics, of course, and of course the two together. But the last thing I would comment on, which again is related to AI, is this rise of computing. Computing's always been important, but now it's becoming the central story because of AI. And of course, the scale of it is such that optics is becoming really close to semiconductors. And perhaps this is the biggest change of all. These have been two separate worlds, the two separate worlds now, but the interaction that's taking place is such that system designers have to take both into account, and it's getting so close that this is really changing both spheres, communications and computing, and that to me is probably the biggest development since the dot-com bubble.
So we've looked back at the history of OFC briefly, but looking forward to this year's show, what are you expecting to see?
I guess there will be a range of themes. I mentioned AI. Some people talk about the AI era, so that's for sure a topic which will dominate, I think, some of the messaging as well as presentations and talks, which we expect to see. And I think it has two elements. One is really the element of optics for AI. So how can I build and get the optical interconnects done there for building large clusters of AI processors for the next generation of generative AI models? How do I get the connectivity to those clusters that I can transfer learning data, that I can approach the models through web front ends and so on and so forth? And the other area is probably using AI for optics to making network operation easier, helping people to do more with less resources. I think there's a lack of skilled workforce in a lot of the areas, and driving operational costs out of the network. And I think there are some very exciting things in there that you can use generative AI as kind of next generation human-machine interface, that you can automate processes, that you can make things more intuitive. So I think the best network is probably the network you will never see, and which is kind of self-healing and deals with optimizing it and correcting errors autonomously.
And everything that Jörg describes is really interesting, and you can tell he's very much a systems engineer. In my particular case, I'm more interested in perhaps the transceiver or component level. I'm very interested in coherent optics because the symbol rate keeps going up, and what was remarkable, say, last year with 200 gigabaud, people are now talking about 1600 ZR standard from the OIF, and that's maybe 260 gigabaud. There's also talk about the generation after that, not that people necessarily know how that will be achieved. So the baud rate keeps going up, and you think, well, how can it keep going up? But it is. And the question is, and it keeps being asked every year, when does it reach a limit that it doesn't make sense to try because it's just too complicated and too expensive? So that's one theme I'm always interested in. The other thing is co-package optics. It's a technology that's probably been spoken of now for 10 years. And last year at the Executive Forum, there were many people that were quite skeptical about it, saying things like it's always a technology that's 2 years hence. But I think there's starting to be very strong evidence that it's starting to happen, that there's systems that are using it, and it's reaching a maturity. Now, so things are going to happen quickly now, even though necessarily the technology isn't that new because people are familiar with it. So that's another exciting development that OFC will shed some light on. And then the obvious is traditional pluggable transceivers. 800 gig is now a given, 1.6 terabit, 3.2 terabit. These are remarkable rates and developments. And it also implies what comes after, say, 200 gig serial electrical lanes and 200 gigs optical lanes. So when people go to 400, that's super challenging. So again, what's happening there? What's that starting to look like? So if you just combine what Jörg described and these developments, and that's not everything, but it's a lot.
From what I hear, network resiliency is also expected to be a major talking point at the show, especially given recent geopolitical events. Is this a topic you'll both be following?
Well, let me let Jörg address this, because I know this is really dear to his heart.
It is, right, because if you look at it, so I think historically, right, I always say the biggest enemy of the optical network is the excavator, right? And it happens that occasionally there are kind of fiber breaks and so on, but in most of the cases, we looked at resiliency as an event which is caused from random failures, and we had, incredible availability numbers, very reliable communication and so on and so forth. Now, if we take natural disasters into account, which are more frequent, if we look into failures, and if we look into sabotage, particularly also sabotage by state sponsors, actors, I think we have impressively seen how vulnerable our infrastructure can be. Look at the subsea cables in the Baltic Seas and other incidents which really have brought this topic up to the attention of policymakers and the general public. So I think in times where random failures are not anymore the primary source of disruption, as are kind of rare events, we need to rethink network resilience. And I think we need to look into two different areas. And one area is, do we need to add more resilience to our network in order to get an increased level of survivability? Or do we just need to look into how we can fix problems quicker so that we have shorter mean time to repair? And probably the right solution is somewhere in the middle, or is it in a combination of the two. What is true in any case is, I think, that in order to be able to understand what is going on and react quickly, and you need to have the monitoring systems in place which help you to distinguish normal from abnormal operation, finding out quickly what is going on, where things are going on, and then take the appropriate measures. And I think there's a whole raft of activities at OFC addressing this under the heading of joint communication and sensing, fiber sensing, and so on. We can do much more than just detecting where a fiber break happens, but you can look into temperature changes, you can look into strain, you can look into pressure, kind of other things which give you a much more comprehensive picture of what is happening. I think that can give us an additional level of security here.
I've got nothing to add to that.
There is maybe an interesting additional point, Gareth, which I want to mention. I think that comes up too, right? So if we talk about resilience, a lot of this is also about having to look at maybe using different systems. So don't rely on the same kind of system. And I think some of the activities which we are also seeing increasingly at OFC are very excited and go into that direction too, and that's the satellite communication space, right? I think historically satellite communication, I would say, was relatively narrow band, and we see a lot of interesting developments there that what we do on the terrestrial side and what we do on the satellite side somehow gets together. So there are low Earth orbit constellations, Starlink, Amazon Kuiper. There are also smaller companies building up dedicated network infrastructure in space to complement what we have in ground to either give you communication when no fiber is available or give you an additional level of security. And there's a lot of interest in identifying what the commonalities and the differences are, but also trying to exploit a common ecosystem of components, for instance, the coherent transceivers, which Roy already mentioned.
Now, we can't finish the podcast without talking about the rump sessions. These are always hugely popular. Roy, you're one of the organizers of this year's sessions, and Jörg, you're one of the participants. Now, for people not familiar, can you describe what rump sessions are? And can you also say what we can expect to see at this year's OFC?
Okay, so rump sessions are a nice way to end the day with always provocative topics, but not too serious and with free beer and a lot of audience interaction with arguments by great panelists. So it's a fun event, as well as occasionally touching on real insight. This year, and it relates to what we've just been discussing, is a hypothetical scenario where the global network is destroyed by some extraordinary event. I'm not going into too much detail, but the assumption is it's alien intervention. But the good news is that R&D sites still exist, manufacturing still exists, and the expertise still exists. So the rump session is setting 3 teams to argue how would they go about architecting a brand new global network with a clean slate. And the other thing to say is we're giving them up to a 10-year timescale, so it can be ramped up. But the idea of the 10-year timescale is that emerging technologies that may not quite be mature enough now, but which could be mature in the next 5 years, say, or in that sort of period, could also be incorporated. So we're giving people a clean slate, but we're also giving them the opportunity to even think a little bit ahead as to what could be incorporated that's not quite ready now.
And I think 10 years is a good time frame, right? As Bill Gates says, we always overestimate what we can do in 1 year and underestimate what we can do in 10 years. So I think there's a wealth of tools which we can use. I mean, to me, this rump session is really quite different from previous editions. In previous editions, we had a topic which was controversial. We had kind of provocateurs and everything here. But now we have a team challenge, and our Comms Adventures team, which consists of Chris Cole, Glenn Wellbrook, Catherine Schmidtke, and myself, we are clearly ready to take on the challenge. We anticipate that the audience will enjoy this session as much as we do already during our preparation. And using the clean slate approach, which Roy mentioned, and taking a holistic view there, truly sparks our imagination. At this point, I don't want to spoil anything. So if you want to know more, just join us.
I don't want you to tip off the other teams, and the other teams but first of all, we're relieved to hear that you've already started. Your team has started. The bottom line is, let's just say this, we're delighted with all the people that have participated. We believe we've got some fantastic teams together. So just to mention very briefly, in the other 2 teams, we've got Professor Paulina Bayville, Peter Windsor, Vijay, Dave Welsh. Vijay's ex-Google, now in a startup. We've got Tad Hofmeister in the final team, Chris Dorr, Rebecca Shavitz, and Maxim Kushnerov. And all I can say is these people are all very busy, but they are really ignited by this topic. And we got almost all the speakers within 48 hours of proposing this idea. So people are very enthusiastic. And it should be really interesting because how often do you get to tackle an engineering problem where it's not adding to an existing thing, it's using your complete creativity. So we're the organisers are really thrilled by this. It seems that the teams are really thrilled by this, and as Jörg said, we just hope the audience has a great evening, and maybe some really profound thoughts will be sparked.
And that's everything for today's show. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics we discussed, please reach out on our social media channels. Thanks for listening.